We're going to discuss the Pythagorean Theorem, but before we do, I want to go ahead and review what we have learned so far. Let's look at this. If we needed to solve x squared equals 4, in order to do that, we would have to undo the square. To undo the square, we're going to take the square root. So when we take the square root, we're left with x on the left-hand side. And when we take the square root of 4, we want two numbers who can multiply together, or who multiply by itself to get 4. So a number that times itself is 4. So the square root of 4 is 2. And remember, there was 20 perfect squares that you had to memorize, and 4 was one of them. So the square root of 4 is plus or minus 2. Because remember, when you take the square root, you get two answers, the plus answer and the minus answer, or the positive answer and the negative answer. Now let's do x squared equals negative 4. However, if you were to take the square root of negative 4, remember, we can't take the square root of a negative number, so we can say there's no real solution. Now what about going backwards? Let's say we have the square root of x equals 4. To get rid of the square root, we have to square both sides. When we square both sides, we're left with x on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, we're going to do 4 squared, which gives us 16. Remember, we also have to check our answers. So if x is equal to 16, that means the square root of 16 is equal to 4, which it is, which means that this is a true solution. About the square root of x equals negative 4. If we were to square both sides, we would get x equals 16. But when we solve and check it, the square root of 16 is not equal to negative 4, which means there's no real solution. Let's try to solve this one. The square root of negative x equals 4. So when we square both sides, we're left with negative x equals 16. So negative x equals 16, well, then we have to divide both sides by negative 1, leaving us x equals just positive 16, right? Or I'm sorry, x equals negative 16 because we're dividing both sides by negative 1. So now we have x equals negative 16, and when we check our answer, the square root of negative 16, well, two negatives make a positive, so the square root of positive 16 is 4. So x is equal to negative 16. Let's go ahead and review some geometry. What we're looking at here is a right angle. Remember, a right angle is going to have this little square here that denotes that this is 90 degrees, and since it's 90 degrees, we call it a right triangle. A right triangle is made up of two legs and a hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always going to be the side across from the 90-degree angle. Let's look at this right triangle. The lengths of the sides of the two legs, we have one leg that has a length of 4, another leg with a length of 3, and the hypotenuse has a length of 5. If we were to take 3 and square it, we would get 3 squared, which is 9. If we were to take we would get 9 square units. If we were to take the 4 and square it, we would get 16 square units. And if we were to take the 5 and square it, we would get 25 square units. But also notice that 16 and 9 is actually equal to 25. So from this, we actually get what is called the Pythagorean Theorem, where if we take one leg and square it, plus the other leg and square it, we get the hypotenuse squared. So the Pythagorean theorem is if the hypotenuse of a right triangle has a length of c and the legs have lengths a and b, then a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So the first leg squared plus the second leg squared is equal to the hypotenuse squared. So let's say we want to find the hypotenuse of a right triangle with legs of 8 and 15. So we're looking for the hypotenuse, which remember is C. And the legs are 8 and 15. So one of them is A and one of them is B. Let's go ahead and let 8 be A and 15 be B. So our Pythagorean theorem says that our C squared equals A squared plus B squared. So we're trying to find C, so we're going to keep the C squared. But we're going to go ahead and let 8 be A and 15 be B. So we get 8 squared instead of A squared, and we get 15 squared instead of B squared. So now we actually have to solve for C. So the first thing we want to do is simplify the right-hand side. 8 squared is 64, and 15 squared is 225. Remember, those are perfect squares that you should have memorized. Now we'll add them together. 64 plus 225 is 289. Now we have C squared equals 289. The last step is to take the square root of both sides. So we have the square root of 289, which is one of the perfect squares that you should have memorized. The square root of 289 is 17, which tells us that C, the hypotenuse, is going to be 17. Let's try another one. Let's find the hypotenuse of a right triangle with legs of 6 and 7. So again, we're going to start with the Pythagorean theorem, and we're going to let 6 be A and 7 be B. So we get C squared equals 6 squared plus 7 squared. So let's go ahead and do our exponents. So C squared is equal to 36 plus 49. We'll add 36 and 49 together, and that gives us 85. So we're going to square root both sides, and we get C is equal to the square root of 85, which is not one of our perfect squares, so we can go ahead and approximate it using a calculator, and it gives us 9.2 approximately. Find the hypotenuse of a right triangle with legs of 9 and 12. Go ahead and try this one on your own to see if you can find the answer. All right, you should have came up with the answer 15. Let's try another one. Find the hypotenuse of a right triangle with the legs of 1 and 1. You should have gotten the answer square root of 2. This one was a little tricky because you end up with C squared equals 1 squared plus 1 squared. And 1 squared is just 1. So C squared is equal to 1 plus 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So C squared equals 2, which means that C is equal to the square root of 2. Go ahead and try, actually, let's do this one together. We need to find the leg of a right triangle whose hypotenuse is 16 and its other leg is 7. So this time they give us C and they give us one leg, and we're trying to find the other leg. So we can still use Pythagorean theorem, but this time we're trying to find one of the legs. So we're going to say A, and that's going to stand for the leg that we're trying to find. So A squared plus the other leg is 7, so 7 squared equals the hypotenuse is 16, so 16 squared. Now we'll go ahead and do our exponents. 7 squared is 49, and 16 squared is 256. So now we have A squared plus 49 equals 256. This is a two-step equation, so we need to undo the addition first. So we're going to subtract 49 from both sides, and we end up with A squared is equal to 207. So our last step is going to be to square root both sides. When we do that, we get the square root of 207, which is approximately 14.4 on our calculators. Go ahead and try this one on your own. You're going to find the length of the leg whose right triangle, whose hypotenuse is 39. So that means C is 39, and whose other leg is 15. So you can let that leg be B. So C is 39 and B is 15. So go ahead and use A squared plus B squared equals C squared to find out what A is going to be. You should have gotten 36. Try one more. On the length of the leg of a right triangle whose hypotenuse is 20 and whose other leg is 10. So that means that your C is 20 and your B is 10 and you want to find A. You can use the Pythagorean theorem that says A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So A squared plus 10 squared equals 20 squared. Go ahead and see if you can solve for A. All right, you should have gotten the square root of 300, which is approximately 17.3 on your calculator. Let's talk about what a converse is. A converse is a statement when you switch the if and the then parts of a conditional statement. So you take a theorem, like our Pythagorean theorem, that said if a right triangle had hypotenuse A and legs B and C, then A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So now we're going to reverse it, and the converse of the Pythagorean theorem is that if a triangle has sides A, B, and C such that A squared plus B squared equals C squared, then the triangle is a right triangle. Remember before the theorem said that it had to be a right triangle. And then you got A squared plus B squared equals C squared. But now we're switching that and we're saying if you have A squared plus B squared equals C squared, then you have a right triangle. So we can do problems with this. We can actually determine whether a triangle is a right triangle without having to measure the angle to see if it's 90 degrees. All we have to do is know the length of the sides, and if they work in the Pythagorean theorem, then that means that it is a right triangle. So first we're going to determine whether a triangle with sides 12, 35, and 37 is a right triangle. So remember, we're going to use the Pythagorean theorem that says A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Your biggest number is always going to be your hypotenuse. So we're going to try 12 squared plus 35 squared equals 37 squared. Remember, we let 37 be C because it was the biggest number. So let's go ahead and see what we end up with. 12 squared is 144. 35 squared is 1,225. And 37 squared is 1,369. So 144 plus 1,225 is supposed to equal 1,369. And since it does, the answer is yes. A triangle with sides of 12, 35, and 37 is a right triangle. Go ahead and try this one on your own. Oh, no, actually, we'll do this one together. We have sides 8, 12, and 14. So we're going to go ahead and use Pythagorean theorem. And remember, our 14 is our largest number, so it's going to be C. So 8 squared is 64. 12 squared is 144. And 14 squared is 196. So 64 plus 144 is supposed to equal 196. And since it doesn't, 64 plus 144 is actually 208, and it does not equal 196. That means the answer is no, it is not a right triangle. Now try this question on your own. Okay, you should have gotten 15 squared plus 18 squared equals 22 squared. And if you go ahead and evaluate those, you'll find out that 15 squared plus 18 squared is not equal to 22 squared, which means that no, this is not a right triangle. Go ahead and try this one now. Okay, this one is yes. 16 squared plus 30 squared is equal to 34 squared. So that means it is a right triangle. All right, that's all we have for today.